For Father's Day, I used my life savings to buy my dad a six-figure Mercedes. His thank you? He raised a glass at his party, pointed right at me, and announced to everyone, "I'm proud of all my children, with the exception of the failure sitting at this table." He had no idea that this failure was holding a secret that could destroy his entire legacy. My name is Eliza Matthews, and I am 32 years old. The drive from New York City to Wellesley, Massachusetts is a familiar one, a 3.5-hour straight shot up I-95 and across the Mass Pike. But today, it felt different. The new leather scent of the obsidian black Mercedes S-Class filled the cabin, a fragrance I had desperately hoped would smell like recognition. It was more than a car. It was a rolling 2.5-ton statement piece and meticulously crafted report card of my success, presented on 4 wheels. For the past year, I had worked with a singular, ferocious focus. I had traded lavish vacations for late nights at the Goldman Sachs office, replaced fine dining with sad desk lunches, and funneled every spare dollar into the fund for this car. All for a single, childish fantasy: to see my father, Richard Matthews, look at something I had achieved, and finally, just once, nod with pride. My hands tightened on the smooth leather of the steering wheel as I turned onto the tree-lined street of my childhood. Each perfectly manicured lawn and sprawling colonial house was a reminder of the world I had fought to escape, and yet a world whose approval I still craved like a drug. Hope is a stubborn, foolish thing. It flickered in my chest, a tiny, vulnerable flame against the hurricane of my past experiences. But with every foot closer to the imposing brick facade of my parents' home, a familiar cold dread began to creep in, whispering the same old line, "It will never be enough." I pulled into the driveway. Before I could even fully turn off the engine, the front door opened. My father stood there, not with a welcoming smile, but with a frown of mild irritation etched onto his face. I was early, of course. "Eliza," he said, his voice flat. It was a statement, not a greeting. His eyes immediately bypassed me, locking onto the car. He walked towards it, his gait the confident stride of a man who assesses value for a living. There was no warmth, only analysis. "Mercedes S-Class, the 580 model," he murmured, his tone the same one he used when evaluating a property. He circled the vehicle slowly, his reflection gliding across the flawless black paint. He ran a single critical finger along the chrome. "They've changed the grille design. I preferred the old one." My heart, which had been pounding with a nervous rhythm, began to sink. I held out the key, the 3-pointed star emblem cool against my clammy palm. "Happy early Father's Day, Dad." He took the key without making eye contact. His gaze was still scanning the car, and then, with an almost imperceptible squint, he found it. "There's a scratch here," he said, pointing to a minuscule mark near the wheel well. A blemish so tiny it was likely from transport. "New, and it's already flawed." The words hung in the air, a cold splash of water on that tiny, flickering flame of hope. He got in, started the engine, and took it for a short, silent loop around the block. I stood on the driveway, feeling foolish and small, the way I always did in his presence. When he returned, he didn't park it in the wide, open space in front of the house where it could be admired. He drove it straight into the 3-car garage, parking it next to his aging Porsche and my mother's sensible SUV. He was hiding it. He stepped out, tossing the key back to me as if I were a valet. "It's adequate," he said, his final verdict delivered. Then came the final crushing blow. "They must be paying you a fortune on Wall Street to be wasting money like this. You could have bought a plot of land with that kind of capital. A real asset. That was it. That was his thank you. No hug, no proud smile, no acknowledgement of the sacrifice it represented. He had taken my grand gesture, my offering of love and success, and reduced it to a poor financial decision. He turned and walked back into the house, leaving me alone on the driveway. I stood there for a long time, staring at the closed garage door. The gift I had poured my heart and soul into was now just another one of his possessions, tucked away in the dark. A profound, hollow numbness spread through me, a familiar ache that had been my companion for my entire life. I walked into the house and up to my old bedroom, the silence of the place pressing in on me. From my window, I could see the top of the garage. I sank onto my bed, the weight of it all finally hitting me. Why do I even bother trying? The question echoed in the silent room, a ghost of every other time I had asked it before. The question, why do I even bother trying, hung in the air of my old bedroom, a familiar ghost. The answer, I knew, wasn't simple. It was buried under decades of accumulated evidence, a private collection of slights and dismissals I kept locked away. Sitting there on the edge of the bed, the silence of the house allowed the door to that museum to creak open, and the exhibits of my past began to light up one by one. The first memory to surface was from my senior year of high school. I was 17, and I had just won the state debate championship. I remember the drive home, the heavy gold-plated trophy sitting on the passenger seat, its weight feeling like validation itself. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I burst through the front door, trophy held high, my face flushed with a rare, uncomplicated joy. My father was in the living room, his eyes fixed on the flickering stock ticker on CNBC. He glanced up, his gaze briefly touching the trophy before dismissing it. "Debate, huh?" he said, his attention already returning to the screen. "That's nice. James just landed a summer internship with Bob Henderson's firm. Now that's real-world experience." He never touched the trophy. He never asked what the final debate topic was. He never acknowledged the months of preparation, the late nights researching, the sheer terror of public speaking that I had conquered. My victory was nothing more than a trivial hobby compared to my older brother's first step onto the corporate ladder, a path my father had paved for him. The next morning, I found the trophy not on the mantelpiece in the living room, where James's football trophies gleamed under the track lighting, but on a high shelf in the dusty storage closet, placed there by our housekeeper. It sat there among old photo albums and discarded Christmas decorations, an invisible monument to an invisible achievement. It became the first piece in my museum of rejections. Another exhibit lit up, this one from a year later, the day my acceptance letter from Cornell University arrived. It was a thick envelope, and inside was the news, a full-ride scholarship. My mother, Caroline, had actually cried tears of joy, hugging me tightly in the kitchen. She saw it for what it was, a monumental achievement, a ticket to a future I had earned entirely on my own. I waited until dinner to tell my father, my hands trembling slightly under the table. When I announced the news, the cheerful clinking of silverware stopped. My father placed his fork down on his porcelain plate with a deliberate, heavy click that echoed in the sudden silence. "Cornell?" he said, his voice laced with a cool contempt that was far more chilling than shouting. He leaned back in his chair. "Was Boston University, my alma mater, not good enough for you? Or do you think you're so special you have to go halfway across the country?" He didn't see the scholarship. He didn't see the honor. He saw my success as a personal betrayal, a public rejection of his legacy and his control. "What are you trying to prove by going there, Eliza?" he continued, his eyes narrowing. "That you don't need the Matthews name?" That question became a phantom that haunted my college years, turning my pride into a constant, gnawing guilt. I wasn't just getting an education, I was apparently committing an act of rebellion. But the most painful exhibit in my museum wasn't a trophy or a letter. It was a memory bathed in the orange glow of spilled juice. I was 12. We had a new Persian rug in the dining room, an expensive acquisition my father was immensely proud of. My hand slipped, and my glass of orange juice tumbled, creating a sticky, vibrant stain on the cream-colored silk. My father's rage was immediate and terrifying. "You clumsy, useless girl," he roared, his voice bouncing off the high ceilings. "Do you have any idea how much that cost?" Tears welled in my eyes, blurring his furious face. I turned my gaze to my mother, a desperate, silent plea for help, for a shield, for a single word of defense. But my mother, my warm and loving mother, just crumpled. Her shoulders sagged, her eyes darted to the floor, and she rushed to the kitchen for a cloth, muttering apologies to my father for me. She never once looked at him and said, "Richard, stop. She's just a child. It was an accident." Her silence was a wall, solid and impenetrable. It was a message far crueler than my father's words. It told me I was utterly alone in my own home. The protection a child is supposed to take for granted, the unconditional defense from a parent, was a language my family simply did not speak. Not to me, anyway. Staring out the window of my bedroom now at the same manicured lawn, the same silent, imposing houses, it all became painfully clear. These weren't isolated incidents. They were a pattern, a lifelong curriculum designed to teach me my place. The outsider, the disappointment, the one who was not and would never be enough. A cold resolve began to form in the pit of my stomach, pushing aside the familiar ache of sorrow. I had survived this. I had built a life, a career, a self, far away from this suffocating perfection. I escaped this place once. I built a life for myself on my own terms. The thought wasn't a question anymore. It was a statement of fact. And it was the first brick in a new foundation. I'm sure many of you have a museum of your own, a collection of achievements no one applauded, of efforts no one saw. Have you ever won a trophy that your family treated like a worthless decoration? If you've ever felt that way, share the story of your invisible trophy in the comments. Let's let each other know that we're not alone in this fight for recognition. The statement I made to myself in my childhood bedroom, "I escaped this place once," was true. But freedom, I had learned, had a steep price, one I paid for in sweat and solitude. My first years in New York City were a brutal lesson in survival. I left the sprawling comfort of Wellesley for a cramped fifth-floor walk-up in Brooklyn, where the nightly symphony of sirens became my lullaby, and the steam hissing from the ancient radiator was my only roommate. It was a world away from the life my brother James was living. I remember the Sunday video calls, a family ritual I both dreaded and felt obligated to attend. I'd angle my laptop to hide the peeling paint on my wall, forcing a smile as James, framed by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his luxurious Back Bay condo, a graduation gift from our father, casually mentioned his golf game at the country club with one of Dad's business partners. While he was networking on the 9th hole, I was surviving on instant ramen and cheap coffee, saving every dollar to pay for a financial modeling course that I hoped would give me an edge. While he was being groomed, I was grinding. I worked 16-hour days at Goldman Sachs, not out of some grand ambition, but out of a primal fear. The fear that if I failed, I would prove my father right. I would be exactly who he always thought I was. 8 years of that relentless pace, of sacrificing my 20s at the altar of my career, finally paid off. The day I was promoted to senior investment strategist, the youngest in the firm's history, I didn't celebrate with champagne and friends. I stood alone in my glass-walled office at 200 West Street, long after everyone else had gone home, and watched the glittering tapestry of the Manhattan skyline. The city lights seemed to pulse with energy, a reflection of the frantic, triumphant beat of my own heart. For a moment, I felt invincible. I called home, needing to share the news. My mother answered, her voice a hushed, hurried whisper. "Oh, honey, that's wonderful," she said, but I could hear the television in the background. My father's nightly business report. "I'm so proud of you, but your father's watching his show. I'll tell him later." I spoke to him a few days later. His reaction was a masterclass in psychological demolition. "Good," he said, his tone flat and unimpressed. "But don't forget, Goldman is a partner of our firm. The Matthews name carries weight, even in your world." Just like that, with a single sentence, he siphoned all the air out of my victory. He took my 8 years of grueling work, my sacrifice, my singular achievement, and stamped his own name on it. My success wasn't mine. It was an extension of his influence. The joy I had felt standing in my office curdled into a familiar, bitter taste in my mouth. I was, once again, just a reflection of him. It was in the depths of that particular loneliness that the seed of doubt, planted long ago, finally began to sprout. I was idly scrolling through my 23andMe results one evening, something I'd done out of curiosity months before, when I noticed it again, an anomaly, a distant cousin match that had no connection to the well-documented Mayflower-descended Matthews family tree. A morbid curiosity took hold, a dangerous, reckless impulse to pull at a thread I knew I should leave alone. On my next visit home, my heart pounding with a strange mix of terror and determination, I pocketed the old silver-backed hairbrush from my father's bathroom vanity. It felt like a crime. I sent the hairs from the brush, along with a new DNA sample from myself, to a discreet paternity testing lab I found online, paying extra for confidential results. The email arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. The subject line was clinical. "Your paternity test results are ready." I stared at it for a full 10 minutes, my cursor hovering over the link, my breath caught in my throat. My hand was shaking so badly I had to steady it with my other. Finally, I clicked. I entered the secure password and the PDF loaded. I scrolled past the technical jargon, my eyes searching for the one line that mattered. And then I saw it. The words were stark, black and white, stripped of all emotion. Probability of paternity, 0% 0. The world tilted on its axis. I read the line again, and again. It didn't seem real. A wave of dizziness washed over me, followed by a cold, shocking clarity. It was a nuclear bomb delivered in a PDF file, a secret with the power to obliterate everything I thought I knew about my life, my family, my own identity. I saved the document to an encrypted folder on my laptop, naming it simply Contingency. It was a secret I didn't know how to handle, a truth that was both a terrifying curse and in some strange, twisted way, the ultimate liberation. It was a ticking time bomb, and the annual Father's Day gathering was just around the corner. The annual Matthews Father's Day gathering was less a family event and more a meticulously staged piece of theater. And this year, my car was the unwilling star of the show. When I arrived, the day after my initial chilling encounter with my father, my breath caught in my throat. There it was, the Mercedes S-Class, my gift, strategically parked at the head of the circular driveway. It gleamed under the warm June sun, positioned perfectly for every arriving guest to admire. It wasn't a gift anymore, it was a prop, a testament to the wealth and success of Richard Matthews. My father was standing beside it, a master of ceremonies in his element, dressed in a tailored navy blue suit that probably cost more than my first car. He held a crystal glass of what I knew was Macallan 18, gesturing with it as he regaled a group of his business partners. He was playing the part of the magnanimous patriarch, a man so successful he could casually acquire six-figure vehicles. When he saw me approaching, his performance didn't falter. He simply gave me a curt, dismissive nod, the kind one might give to a caterer, before turning his attention back to his audience. I was invisible. My mother rushed out to meet me, her smile tight with anxiety. "Eliza, you look lovely," she whispered, her hand finding mine. It was cold and clammy, a familiar sign of her nervousness. She was a gentle soul caught in the orbit of a tyrant, and her warmth was always tinged with fear. The performance continued as my brother James arrived with his family. His wife, Catherine, a woman who seemed airbrushed to perfection, gave me a look that was a masterclass in polite indifference before gliding past. James, the golden boy, clapped our father on the back, his eyes fixed on the car. "Wow, Dad, beautiful new ride," he boomed, his voice carrying across the lawn. "Treating yourself, huh?" I held my breath, a foolish part of me still waiting for a sliver of truth. For my father to say, "No, this was a generous gift from your sister." Instead, Richard let out a hearty, practiced laugh, a laugh that was all for show. "Well, son," he declared, loud enough for everyone to hear, "success has its privileges. A man has to treat himself sometimes." The words struck me with the force of a physical blow. In front of his partners, his friends, and his own family, he had publicly erased me from my own act of love. He had stolen my gesture, my sacrifice, and claimed it as a monument to his own success. The air felt thick, hard to breathe. I felt a gentle squeeze on my arm and turned to see my younger sister, Sophia. She was the only one whose eyes held genuine warmth. "I heard about the promotion, Liz," she murmured, her voice a small anchor in the swirling sea of pretense. "That's incredible, truly." Her simple, honest words were a stark contrast to the grand deception playing out on the lawn. I tried to retreat, to find a quiet corner on the sprawling patio, but the pain was relentless. I watched as my father led group after group of guests on a tour of the Mercedes, proudly pointing out its features with a level of enthusiasm he had never, not once, shown for any of my accomplishments. Later, as I passed his study on my way to the powder room, I overheard his voice through the partially open door. He was speaking with one of his oldest partners, a man I'd known my whole life. "Oh, the car?" my father was saying, his voice dripping with condescending amusement. "Eliza bought it. The girl's always been desperate for attention. A little success in New York, and she thinks she's a Rockefeller." He paused, and I could practically hear the smirk in his next words. "But she forgets, without the foundation I built, without the Matthews name opening doors she doesn't even know about, she'd be nothing." That was it. That was the knife twisting. It wasn't just that he had stolen the credit, it was that he had poisoned the motive. My gift wasn't an act of love, it was a pathetic cry for attention from a daughter he fundamentally believed was nothing without him. The quiet dignity I had been clinging to all day began to crumble. A cold fury, slow and deep, started to build within me. Before I could process the new wound, James cornered me by the French doors leading to the garden. The superficial charm he wore for the guests had vanished, replaced by the familiar look of disdain he reserved for me. "Listen, Eliza," he hissed, his voice low and threatening. "Dad's having a good day. Don't you dare ruin it with that long face of yours. We all know you're just trying to make a scene." He leaned in closer. "And cut it out with all the weird questions about Mom's past you've been asking. Just be grateful for what you have. Everything you are is because of him. Don't you ever forget that." He walked away, leaving me standing there, the pieces clicking into place. This wasn't just a dysfunctional family. It was a system, a carefully constructed hierarchy designed to protect the king and his chosen heir, and I was the designated threat to its stability. The harmony James was so keen to protect was built on a foundation of lies and my silent compliance. But I could feel that foundation starting to crack. The carefully constructed calm I had been desperately holding on to shattered just before the dinner bell rang. James found me in the library, cornering me between a towering shelf of leather-bound classics and the cold, unlit fireplace. The room, meant to be a sanctuary of quiet contemplation, instantly became an interrogation chamber. The mask of the charming host he wore for the guests dissolved, revealing the cold, hard face of the family enforcer. "Listen here, Eliza," he hissed, his voice a low, menacing current under the surface of the party's cheerful murmur. He took a deliberate step closer, invading my personal space with the same sense of entitlement he moved through the world with. "Dad is having a great day. A perfect day. Don't you dare ruin it with that miserable long face of yours. It's embarrassing." His eyes narrowed into slits. "And I swear if I hear you asking one more weird question about Mom's past, there will be consequences. You're upsetting her, and you're upsetting the balance of this family." He jabbed a finger in my direction, the gesture sharp and accusatory. "Who do you think you are? You're a banker, that's it. That little apartment in the city, that fancy job. Every single thing you have is a byproduct of what Dad built. It's because of the Matthews name, so do us all a favor and remember your place." He didn't see me as his sister, he saw me as a liability, a loose cannon threatening the fragile, fraudulent harmony that served his interests so perfectly. His words were a brutal affirmation of the family's unspoken constitution. Richard was king, James was the crown prince, and I was the court jester, there for occasional amusement, but easily disposed of if I stepped out of line. I said nothing, I just stared at him, my silence a more potent response than any argument I could muster. It seemed to unnerve him. He scoffed, a short, sharp sound of disgust, and walked away, leaving me alone with the scent of old leather and fresh contempt. Dinner was served in the formal dining room, a cavernous space that was as magnificent as it was cold. The long, polished mahogany table reflected the glittering crystals of the chandelier above, a perfect mirror of the Matthews family. A beautiful, flawless surface hiding a dark, empty core. The seating arrangement was a deliberate act of psychological warfare. I was placed at the far end of the table, an isolated island between an elderly, half-deaf business associate of my father's and his equally quiet wife. The real conversation, the laughter, the power, was all concentrated 20 feet away, where Richard and James held court. My father's gaze would sweep down the table, a king surveying his subjects, but it would always pass over me as if my chair were empty. I was a ghost at my own family's feast. The staff, in crisp white uniforms, brought out the courses, each a work of art. First, a creamy lobster bisque in a delicate porcelain bowl. Then a perfectly cooked beef Wellington with a rich truffle sauce, served with a side of slender asparagus spears drizzled with hollandaise. The food was exquisite, a menu worthy of a Michelin star restaurant, but it all tasted like ash in my mouth. I ate mechanically, lifting the heavy silver fork to my mouth, chewing, swallowing, each bite a reminder of my profound isolation. I could hear my father's booming laugh as he recounted a story about a recent real estate deal in the Seaport district, heaping praise on James for his sharp instincts. I was tasting humiliation, a flavor I knew all too well. Then my father's attention finally turned to me, and I felt a familiar chill run down my spine. It was a predator's gaze, slow and deliberate, singling out the weakest member of the herd for sport. "Eliza," he called out, his voice silencing the table. All heads turned to me. I felt like a specimen under a microscope. "I hear your line of work, that whole finance world, is rather volatile these days, isn't it?" He didn't wait for an answer, turning to the man beside him. "Not stable like real estate, not a real, tangible asset. Just numbers on a screen, aren't they? Air." I took a slow, steadying breath, marshaling the professional composure I use to command boardrooms. "Actually, Dad, the market has shown significant growth in the tech sector, and our projections—" "Numbers," he cut me off with a sharp, dismissive wave of his hand. "Illusions, it's not the foundation of real, lasting wealth." He had successfully delegitimized my entire career in 2 sentences. But he wasn't done. One of the guests, a woman whose name I'd forgotten, tried to be polite. "And are you seeing anyone, my dear? A successful young woman like you must have men lining up." Before I could form a polite deflection, my father seized the opportunity like a wolf pouncing on its prey. He leaned back in his grand, throne-like chair, a cruel, knowing smile playing on his lips. He spoke to the entire table, but his words were poisoned darts aimed directly at my heart. "Eliza has always been more focused on proving something than on building something," he said, his voice casual, as if discussing the weather. "Some people, you see, they chase professional achievements to fill other voids in their lives." The implication was brutally clear, a public vivisection of my personal life. He was suggesting my career was nothing more than compensation for my failure to marry and produce an heir, for my failure to follow the path he had deemed appropriate for a Matthews woman. The air at the table grew thick and heavy. I saw my mother's face pale, her hand trembling as she reached for her water glass. I saw the unmistakable glint of smug satisfaction in James's eyes, and I saw the look of genuine horror on Sophia's face from across the table, her eyes wide with disbelief. In that moment, I wasn't just angry, I wasn't just hurt. A lifetime of being minimized, dismissed, and publicly shamed coalesced into a single cold point in the center of my chest. The humiliation was a physical weight, pressing down, suffocating me, until there was no more room for pain. There was only clarity, a terrifying, liberating clarity. I had nothing left to lose because, in his eyes, I had never had anything to begin with. The charade was over. After dessert plates were cleared and the staff had poured the coffee and brandy, my father stood, tapping a silver spoon against his glass to command attention. This was the tradition, the grand finale of his Father's Day performance, the speech. He began with his usual platitudes, his voice rich and resonant, speaking of legacy, of family, of the values he had worked so hard to build. The words were beautiful, hollow vessels. He raised his glass to James, praising his business acumen and his role in the company's future. He turned to Sophia, commending her grace and her contributions to the community. "Your mother and I," he said, beaming at them, "could not be prouder." And then his gaze found me. The room, which had been filled with murmurs of approval, fell utterly silent. The air grew heavy, thick with anticipation. He let the silence stretch, a showman milking the moment. "As I reflect on the achievements of my children," he said, his tone shifting, becoming more ponderous, more philosophical, "I am reminded of how different the definition of success can be." He paused again, a calculated beat of silence. "I am proud of all my children," he declared, and in that single deceptive moment, a foolish, battered shard of hope flickered within me. But then came the executioner's blow. He continued, his voice laced with the precise cruelty of a surgeon's scalpel. "With the exception of the failures sitting at this table." The words didn't just land, they detonated. A profound, deathly silence consumed the room, broken only a second later by a few uncertain, nervous laughs from guests who assumed it must be some kind of harsh family joke. But I knew. I saw the triumphant sneer on James's face. I saw the absolute horror dawn on Sophia's. I saw my mother's hand fly to her mouth, her face a mask of white terror. This was no joke. This was a public sentencing. I felt the blood drain from my face, a cold, rushing tide that left me numb. My ears roared with a sound like rushing water, drowning out the world. 32 years of striving, 32 years of desperate, aching hope, 32 years of trying to be good enough, smart enough, successful enough. All of it, my entire life's effort, was incinerated in the space of a single brutal sentence. I had come here seeking a crumb of approval, and instead I had been handed a public execution. The final fraying thread that had tethered me to the fantasy of a loving, accepting father snapped. It didn't just break, it disintegrated into dust. There were no tears left. There was no more begging for a love that was never there to begin with. There was only a vast, cold, silent emptiness. And then something strange happened in that void. Instead of crumbling, instead of the hot shame I had expected, an unnatural calm washed over me. It was the eerie stillness at the eye of a hurricane. The pain had reached a threshold so absolute that it had short-circuited my emotional system. On the other side of that agony wasn't despair, but a chilling, crystalline freedom. I no longer cared what any of these people thought. Their opinions, their judgments, their condescending laughter. It was all just noise from a world I no longer belonged to. They had no power over me anymore. I looked directly at my father. It was like seeing him for the first time, not as the towering figure of my childhood, not as the man whose approval I had spent a lifetime chasing, but as a stranger. A cold, cruel stranger who happened to share some of my history. The dynamic between us had irrevocably shifted. I was no longer the pleading child. He was no longer the judge. In that profound glacial silence, I knew exactly what I had to do. It wasn't about revenge. Revenge was a hot, messy emotion, and all I felt was ice. This was about truth. It was about reclaiming the narrative of my own life. It was for me. Slowly, deliberately, my movements measured and calm, I placed my hands on the table and began to stand. The scrape of my chair against the hardwood floor was the only sound in the cavernous dining room. Every eye was on me, a sea of shocked, curious, and horrified faces. The glacial calm that had settled over me held firm, a shield of ice against the fiery humiliation. I was no longer the defendant in this courtroom. I was taking the stand. "Thank you, Father," I began, my voice clear and steady, cutting through the thick silence with an unnerving precision. "Thank you for that enlightening speech." I met his gaze across the long table, a look of pure, cold fury beginning to replace the confident smugness in his eyes. He wasn't used to being challenged. I held his stare, refusing to back down. I've spent 32 years trying to earn an approval that was never going to be granted. Tonight, I finally understand why. I let that statement hang in the air for a moment, letting the weight of it settle on everyone present. Success in the world of Richard Matthews has never been about objective achievement, has it? It's always been about compliance. It's about his children serving as mirrors, reflecting his own glory back at him. I paused, my eyes sweeping over my brother's stunned face. Anyone who fails to provide that perfect reflection is, by definition, a failure. My hand moved slowly, with deliberate intent, to the designer clutch purse sitting on my lap. The same purse that held the key to the Mercedes. But it held something else, far more valuable now. I unclasped it with a soft click. With a grace I didn't know I possessed, I reached inside and retrieved a single, crisp white business envelope. I held it between my thumb and forefinger, a piece of paper that felt as heavy as a slab of granite. "I bought you a car, Dad," I said, my voice dropping slightly, drawing everyone in. Because a childish part of me still hoped that a grand enough gesture could somehow bridge the mysterious gap between us. I've spent 3 decades blaming myself for your inability to show me affection, for your coldness. My gaze flickered to my mother, whose face was now as white as a sheet, her eyes wide with a dawning, frantic terror. She knew what was coming. I turned my eyes back to the man at the head of the table. "I never understood that the problem wasn't with my actions," I said, my voice clear and ringing. "It was with my DNA." A collective gasp sucked the remaining air out of the room. It was a physical sound, a wave of shock that rippled from one end of the table to the other. My mother made a small, strangled noise, like a wounded animal. James's jaw had dropped, his smugness replaced by utter disbelief. Sophia just stared, her hands covering her mouth. I took a few steps forward, my heels clicking purposefully on the floor. I walked to the center of the table and placed the white envelope directly beside my father's half-full snifter of brandy. It lay there, stark and unassuming, a silent bomb in the middle of their perfect, polished world. "This is for you," I said, my voice devoid of all emotion except a final biting irony. "Happy Father's Day." And with that, I turned my back on him. I turned my back on all of them. I didn't wait for a response. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. I didn't give anyone a chance to argue, to deny, to shout. With my spine straight and my head held high, a posture forged not in a finishing school, but in the cutthroat boardrooms of Wall Street, I walked towards the dining room doors. I wasn't running away. I was exiting. Behind me, the spell of silence shattered. I heard the violent scrape of a chair being pushed back, a muffled sob that could only have come from my mother, and then the beginnings of a low, furious roar from the man I had once called my father. The chaos was beginning to erupt, but it was their chaos now, not mine. I didn't look back. I simply pushed open the doors and stepped out into the hall, leaving the wreckage of their perfect evening behind me. I stepped out of the house and into the cool, damp air of the June evening. and the first breath I took felt like a resurrection. It was as if I had been submerged underwater for my entire life and had just broken the surface. My lungs, tight and constricted for so long, finally expanded fully, greedily, taking in the sweet, earthy scent of freshly cut grass and the delicate fragrance of the night-blooming jasmine my mother tended by the porch. The rhythmic, high-pitched chirping of crickets in the garden suddenly seemed to fill the world, a vibrant, living sound that was infinitely louder and more real than the cacophony of rage and shattered pretense I had left behind me. That noise, the implosion of the Matthews dynasty, was no longer my problem. I did not look back. I refused to grant the house that final piece of me, that last backward glance of sentiment or regret. The imposing brick facade, with its warm, glowing windows that promised a sanctuary that was never there for me, no longer represented home. It was just a building now, a beautifully constructed lie, a museum of pain. And I had just turned off the lights and locked the doors for good. My gaze was fixed on a single, gleaming object, the obsidian black Mercedes, sitting proudly and patiently at the head of the driveway. It was no longer a desperate offering, a sacrificial lamb laid at the altar of my father's impossible approval. It was my spoils of war, my chariot, my escape pod, fully fueled and ready for launch. I walked towards it with a steady, unhurried pace, each step on the flagstone path feeling lighter than the last. The crushing weight of 32 years of trying to please an unpleasable man, of contorting myself into a shape that might finally be acceptable, had been lifted. All that was left was me, raw and new and undefined. My hand was perfectly steady as I reached into my purse and retrieved the spare key fob. I pressed the unlock button. The sharp electronic chirp cut through the night's tranquility like a starting pistol, a signal for the beginning of my real life. The car's lights flashed once, a welcoming beacon in the encroaching darkness. I opened the heavy driver's side door and slid into the plush Napa leather seat. It molded to me as if it had been waiting. I closed the door, and the chaotic sounds from the house were instantly muffled, replaced by a profound, luxurious silence. I took a deep, deliberate breath, inhaling the rich scent of new leather and my own newfound freedom. This smell, this car, this moment, it was all mine. It had been paid for with my 80-hour work weeks, my skipped lunches, my relentless solitary grind in a city that eats people alive. It did not belong to Richard Matthews. It belonged to me. I pressed the engine's start button. The V8 engine purred to life, not with a roar, but with a low, confident hum that vibrated through the seat and up my spine. It was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. It was the sound of my own power, my own agency, awakening from a long and fitful slumber. The ambient lighting inside the cabin glowed softly, and the large digital display lit up a clean slate. The headlights blazed to life outside, cutting two brilliant swaths of white light across the perfectly manicured lawn, illuminating the grotesque perfection of the life I was leaving behind. I put the car in reverse, my hand firm and certain on the gear selector. For the first time in this place, I was in complete control. As I began to back out of the long circular driveway, my eyes flickered to the rearview mirror, out of a lifetime of habit, of always checking behind me. What I saw would be seared into my memory forever, a final satisfying tableau. The grand front door of the house flew open with such force that it slammed against the brick wall. The sound lost to me, but the violence of the motion clear. And there he was, Richard Matthews, the titan of industry, the master of control, the patriarch who demanded respect and obedience above all else. He stood there, framed in the doorway, but he was no longer a titan. He was just a small, frantic man, his expensive Italian suit disheveled, his silver hair in disarray. In his hand he clutched the white envelope. He held it as if it were a venomous snake that had just bitten him, the single sheet of paper that had just detonated his entire world. His face, usually a mask of stern composure, was a grotesque contortion of pure, unadulterated rage and disbelief. His mouth was open, stretched in a silent, guttural scream that I couldn't hear but could feel through the thick, soundproof glass of the car. It was the howl of a king who had just been dethroned by his own discarded pawn. The shriek of a man whose carefully constructed reality had just been exposed as a fraud. His empire of lies, his precious legacy, had just been fractured by a single undeniable truth. That was the image I wanted to keep. Not the powerful, intimidating figure who had haunted my entire existence, but this, a frantic, sputtering man, rendered completely and utterly powerless, his authority shattered. The man who had spent a lifetime calling me a failure was now facing the ultimate, inescapable failure of his own making. I didn't hesitate. I didn't pause to savor the moment. There was no need. I had already won. I turned my eyes forward to the open road, shifted the car into drive, and pressed my foot down on the accelerator. The Mercedes responded instantly, surging forward with a smooth, powerful grace that felt like a promise. I steered it onto the quiet suburban street, leaving the house, the man, and a lifetime of rejection, shrinking in my rearview mirror until it was nothing more than a faint glow in the darkness. I was driving away from the ashes of my old life, heading toward an unknown future that, for the first time, was entirely my own to write. The road ahead was dark, but I wasn't afraid. I had the keys. The adrenaline that had fueled my dramatic exit evaporated the moment I stepped into the hushed, impersonal luxury of my room at the Four Seasons in Boston. It was a fortress of anonymity, a stark contrast to the emotionally charged battlefield I had just fled. Exhaustion, deep and bone-weary, washed over me. I dropped my purse on the king-sized bed and sank into a plush armchair, the silence of the room a welcome balm. But the peace was short-lived. I connected my phone to the hotel's Wi-Fi, and the world I had just left behind came screaming back to life. My phone began to vibrate violently against the polished wood of the side table, a relentless, angry buzzing. The screen lit up with a barrage of notifications. 23 missed calls, dozens of text messages. It was the digital aftershock of the bomb I had detonated. I scrolled through them with a detached, clinical coldness. Most were from unknown numbers, likely guests from the party. But the ones that mattered stood out. The first was from James. It was short and venomous. "You destroyed this family tonight. You are a poisonous snake." I felt a pang not of hurt, but of a strange final sadness. He had made his choice. The second was an email forwarded to my personal account from my work address. The sender was from a prestigious Boston law firm. The message was brief, formal, and brutal. "On behalf of our client, Mr. Richard Matthews, we demand the immediate return of the 2024 Mercedes-Benz S-Class, VIN number ending in 7852, which is registered in his name. Failure to comply will result in legal action. He wasn't my father anymore. He was a client. The car wasn't a gift. It was an asset to be recovered. It was exactly what I expected. But then, amidst the storm of vitriol and legal threats, my phone rang again. The caller ID read Sophia. I answered, my voice barely a whisper. Hello? Liz, are you okay? She whispered back, her voice frantic and laced with tears. I could hear muffled shouting in the background. It's chaos here, absolute chaos. Dad is screaming at Mom. She's locked herself in her room. The guests, they all just fled. She took a shuddering breath. I don't care about any of that. I needed to tell you that I love you, okay? That doesn't ever change. Her words were a lifeboat in the middle of a raging sea. I clung to them, the first genuine human connection I had felt all night. I love you too, Soph, I managed to say, my own voice cracking for the first time. I'm okay, I'll call you tomorrow. A few hours later, long after the city outside had quieted, a new message appeared. It was a long wall of text from my mother. My heart hammered against my ribs as I began to read. It was a confession, 32 years in the making. She told me about a man named Thomas Keller. Her first love, a penniless artist her wealthy parents had forbidden her to see. She had gotten pregnant with me before she ever met Richard. Richard, ambitious and eager to marry into her family, knew the truth. In a move that was part chivalry and part shrewd business transaction, he had agreed to marry her anyway, promising to raise me as his own on one condition. She had to sever all ties with her past, to erase Thomas Keller from her life completely. The final lines of her text were blurred by my tears. But he never forgave you, Eliza. He never forgave you for being a constant reminder of the one thing he couldn't own completely, my past. Every time he looked at you, he saw another man. I am so sorry. I was a coward for letting you endure it for so long. The words didn't heal the wounds, but they illuminated the darkness. They provided a reason, a tragic, pathetic reason, for a lifetime of coldness. The mystery was solved, but the pain remained. I spent the next few days in a daze, ordering room service and staring out at the Boston Common, letting the truth settle into my bones. Then I decided to act. I didn't want revenge or money. I just wanted context. A quick search online led me to Thomas Keller, now a successful and well-regarded architect in San Francisco. His firm's website had a professional headshot. He had kind eyes crinkled at the corners. My eyes. With trembling fingers, I composed a careful clinical email. I stated my name, my date of birth, and the fact that a recent DNA test had revealed a discrepancy. I didn't ask for anything. I just stated the facts, then hit send before I could lose my nerve. The reply came less than 24 hours later. Dear Ms. Matthews, it began, I am in receipt of your email. To say that I am in shock would be a profound understatement. I will need some time to process this information. However, I want to be very clear. I would like to meet you. As it happens, I have a business trip to New York City next month. If you are willing, I would be honored to buy you a coffee. Sincerely, Thomas Keller. The civility, the respect, the immediate offer of a meeting without demands or accusations. It was a language I barely understood. It was a stark, glaring contrast to the cold, legal threat I had received from the man who had raised me. One door had slammed shut, violently and permanently. But it seemed another one I never even knew existed, was creaking open. 6 months after the explosion that had irrevocably altered the landscape of my life, Thanksgiving arrived. I wasn't in my sleek, modern apartment in New York, nor was I in the cold, cavernous dining room in Wellesley. I was in Sophia's cozy, slightly cluttered apartment in Cambridge, the air thick with the warm, comforting scents of roasting turkey, sage stuffing, and pumpkin pie. The sound of laughter and the clinking of glasses filled the small space. It felt more like home than my childhood house ever had. The Mercedes was long gone. After a brief but pointed negotiation between my lawyer and Richard's, the car was returned and I was promptly reimbursed. I took that money, the symbol of my misguided sacrifice, and invested it in a fund for my own future, not for a fleeting moment of approval. The silence from Richard and James had been absolute, a gift I hadn't known I needed. My relationship with my mother, Caroline, was a work in progress. We spoke on the phone weekly, our conversations slow and careful, as we navigated the wreckage of the past to build something new and more honest. And twice a week, I sat in the quiet, tasteful office of a therapist, a kind woman who was helping me untangle the 32 years of knots in my soul. Healing wasn't a miracle, it was hard, conscious work. I had met Thomas Keller the month after that fateful Father's Day. We met for lunch at a quiet Italian restaurant in the West Village, a neutral ground for us both. He was a calm, gentle man with a warm smile and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners, just like mine. There were no dramatic, tearful embraces, no grand declarations. It was better than that. It was real. We talked for hours, not about the past, but about the present. We talked about architecture and financial markets, about our shared love for historical biographies and jazz music. He told me stories about my mother when she was young, before the fear set in. She had a brilliant spirit, he said, a sad, fond look in his eyes. She could light up a room. As we parted ways on the sidewalk, he placed a hand gently on my arm. "I can't change the past, Eliza," he said, his voice full of a regret that wasn't his to carry. "And I would never presume to be a father to you, but I would very much like to get to know the remarkable woman you've become." It was a beginning founded not on obligation or biology, but on mutual respect and a quiet, intellectual connection. We had agreed to take it slow, to let whatever relationship we might have grow organically. After our Thanksgiving dinner, as Sophia and I were clearing the plates, my phone rang. It was my mother. I stepped into the quiet of the hallway to answer. I learned that Richard had, as expected, refused to attend Sophia's dinner, opting instead for a quiet meal with James and his family. There was no sadness in my mother's voice, only a weary acceptance. Then her tone shifted. Something had changed. For the first time in my entire life, the familiar undercurrent of fear in her voice was gone. It was replaced by a quiet strength I had never heard before. "Eliza," she said, her voice clear and unwavering, "I need to tell you something. I am so proud of you." I waited instinctively for the but, the qualifier, the reason, proud of my job, my bonus, my accomplishments, but it never came. "I'm not proud because of your job, or the money you make, or anything you've achieved," she continued, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm proud of who you are. I'm proud of your strength, your resilience, and your incredible courage. I should have told you that every single day of your life, and I am so sorry that I didn't." The words I had spent a lifetime yearning to hear from my father, the validation I had chased across finish lines and into boardrooms, finally came to me. They came from my mother, a woman who had finally found her own voice in the wreckage of her old life. Tears streamed down my face, hot and silent, but for the first time, they were not tears of pain or frustration, they were tears of release. In that moment, I understood. Family wasn't about blood or a shared name on a deed. It wasn't a static noun, it was a verb. It was the act of loving, of showing up, of seeing someone for who they truly are and celebrating it. It was Sophia's unwavering loyalty. It was the respectful curiosity of a man I was just beginning to know. It was the newfound strength in my mother's voice. I had freed myself from the weight of a past that was never truly mine, and in doing so, I was no longer living to prove my worth to anyone. My value wasn't determined by a patriarch's approval or a name etched in stone. It was determined by me. I had found my peace not in a grand mansion, but in the quiet, steady beat of my own, finally free heart, and I had a family, a real one. My journey taught me that sometimes the family we're born into is just a starting point. The real family is the one we build. It's built with respect, with acceptance, and with unconditional love. It might be a sister, a newfound connection, a trusted friend, or even just the peace you find within yourself. I want you to look at your own life. Who is your real family? Tag them or share their name in the comments below and tell them why they matter. Let's celebrate the families we choose.